This video is to provide an overview of the Guidelines for Remote Evaluations document. This document was created to provide some thinking points and basic guidelines around how to complete remote evaluations during the COVID-19 pandemic. Information for these guidelines came from several sources, including the U.S. Department of Education, the Oregon Department of Education, and leading associations such as the National Association of School Psychologists. Within this document, you will find some basic guidelines to consider, as well as some specific guidelines for evaluations and some considerations to keep in mind for each eligibility category. The beginning of this document will give some basic overall guidelines to keep in mind as you conduct evaluations. These include things such as evaluations requiring in-person testing or observations may be postponed until school reopens. Current guidance from the Department of Education suggests that these things cannot be conducted remotely, although further guidance may be coming. Other things you'll find in this portion include considerations for remote evaluation, such as assessment measures that may or may not have been validated for remote evaluation, and factors that need to be considered if somebody is suggesting use of a standardized assessment in a non-standardized way. Other things to consider as you're conducting remote evaluations are following guidelines for confidentiality, which includes how documents are shared and who may or may not be present in a room when private conversations are being had. And the other thing to keep in mind is that information is changing rapidly during this time. This video is being created on April 3rd, but we are currently waiting on further guidelines from ODE around remote evaluations. And so always stay up to date with what has most recently been released. Next, we're going to talk just briefly about the guidelines for open initial evaluations and reevaluations specifically.
So beginning off of working on open and initial evaluations, so as mandated by the state, distance learning for all will begin on or before April 13th, which will unfreeze the 60-day evaluation timeline. The first thing evaluators will need to do is determine their new due dates, because the original due dates calculated at the time of consent will no longer be valid due to the school closures. Next, you will need to determine if any portions of your evaluation can still be completed remotely, and if any evaluation components can be substituted for tools that can be done remotely. Next, we will need to connect with families to communicate the new timelines and update them on limitations for the evaluations at this time. We'll need to reach an agreeable extension of the evaluation timeline with the family and document this clearly in a PWN or written agreement, and also document the inability to complete portions of some evaluations due to the Stay Home, Save Lives mandate in a PWN. So as of right now, this recording is being done on April 3rd, but ODE will be providing further guidance for evaluation, so it's important to stay in contact with your district for the most up-to-date information. Overall, we will need to mostly consider documenting everything very clearly during this time, including documenting the extension of deadlines, documenting the time frame that evaluations will be done after school resumes in person, and tools that may be done over a longer span of time than typical. And of course, making sure to provide remote special education supports to students who are in evaluation but can't have their eligibility completed right now. So moving on to guidance for reevaluations. Overall, guidance for reevals have not changed. Below is just some specific guidance published by NASP and ODE regarding school closures due to COVID-19. First, of course, is the consent. Written consent will need to be obtained as usual, not verbal consent. However, IDEA does not specify how the consent must be obtained, so schools that feel comfortable using electronic signatures may do so. Evaluation planning meetings will need to be done virtually, either by phone or video call. Next, we'll just review reevaluations that can be completed while distance learning is in place. The first are reevaluations that can be done via file review. If the team agrees this is appropriate, then the evaluator may move forward with the file review. If reevaluations will need additional measures that can be done via distance, such as rating scales or interviews, then these cases may move forward as well, so long as these tools can be done remotely. If a reevaluation does require in-person testing, then per NASP guidance, these will need to be postponed until school reopens. This will mean going out of compliance of the reevaluation deadline, as reeval deadlines do not change. So evaluators are advised to send PWNs documenting the reason for noncompliance and keep a copy of this in the student's file. Next, we'll just review reevaluations for students in specifically identified as DD or ASD. So if a student is due for a reevaluation under DD and is aging out of this category or otherwise needs additional testing, the same guidelines apply. Anything that requires additional testing will need to be postponed. For autism spectrum disorder, if evaluators need to consider the recently updated state criteria for ASD, evaluators should first look to see if any of this data may be obtained via file review. If it is determined that additional testing is required, they may proceed if these assessments may be done remotely, such as rating scales. However, if in-person testing is deemed necessary, then this case will need to be postponed as well. So overall, Oregon is prohibiting us from holding in-person meetings under the Stay Home, Save Lives mandate, and in-person testing may not be facilitated at this time. So next, we will just be reviewing one of the tables listed below that outlines specific guidelines for different eligibility categories.
So as you scroll through the next portion of this document, you'll find tables for each of the 13 different disability categories covered under IDEA. I'm going to just review the emotional disturbance table as an example for how to read these tables. On the left-hand most side, you'll see the required components of the eligibility listed out. So for example, for emotional disturbance, we start with a review of existing information, developmental history, and so on. The next column lists the possible procedures and measures used to gather the information needed for each of the required components. The next column lists clearly if that portion of the evaluation can be done remotely. So you will see yes, no, or maybe answers that are then explained in greater detail. The following column lists out the optional approaches to gather information. So when the answer is yes, this will tell you how you can do it. For example, on the review of existing information, we list that through review of EC Web or ORSPED archived reports, progress reports, or data on Synergy or another similar platform. For a no example, such as the 2 observations needed for an emotional disturbance evaluation, we list that we're waiting on further guidance from ODE regarding observations. And then the final column in the tables lists potential roadblocks that we may encounter when conducting remote evaluations. So to go back to my previous example of the review of existing information, there may be the roadblocks of accessing files that you need that are not electronically archived in the system. And so as I mentioned before, you'll find these tables for each of the different 13 disability categories as you scroll through the document. Next, we are going to do an overview of further resources that you can look at when thinking through remote evaluations.
This document concludes with links to additional resources, as was mentioned, including several professional associations, as well as links to the Oregon Department of Education and IDEA, as well as Pearson Assessments website, which has more specific information and resources related to many different assessment tools.
Again, this document is intended to be used as an overview and a guideline for you to consider as an evaluator when you're conducting portions of remote evaluation. You should always be mindful of any recently released guidance from ODE or from your specific district before deciding to conduct portions of an evaluation.